2019 seems to be a far cry from what we are currently experiencing at the moment. Ever since the start of this pandemic, it seems that more and more films are taken off the release slate and either moved to a completely different date, or even just thrown onto pay-per-view and streaming services. But I am positive when I say that it could always be worse. You could be watching these terrible films from 2019 while you're on lockdown. So here we go, let's get the worst out of the way from last year with the top worst movies of 2019. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. I'm not going to get into my opinions on The Last Jedi, as I feel that it is irrelevant to the discussion, which is why The Rise of Skywalker doesn't work. While there are elements that are enjoyable, like Kylo Ren, the visual effects, the music by John Williams, and the combat, the negatives vastly outweigh the positives. For one thing, it was made clear by the inclusion of Emperor Palpatine that the story really had nowhere else to go other than the typical nostalgia bait. I was constantly annoyed by how unimaginative the story beats were. The story made no sense whatsoever, and even the novelization made everything worse. It was clear that this trilogy needed a singular authorial voice, because nothing between the installments ever had cohesion. It seemed like all along Disney was in a rush to get their $4 billion back from their purchase of Lucasfilm back in 2012. I am glad that Lucasfilm has done other things to balance some of their bad decisions, like the Mandalorian series on Disney+, Star Wars Rebels, and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Lucasfilm needs to really get their heads together and formulate a full arc for characters before rushing to film. But regardless, I don't think Star Wars is dead because of Rise of Skywalker or any of the films people seem to disagree with nowadays. As long as there are people willing to create stories for the universe, like with the High Republic line, the IP is still there. The upside. Much like many adaptations of much more thoughtful original films, Hollywood just seems to fail at anything subtle or even make any commentary on what they are adapting. The original film from France, called The Untouchables, was more nuanced in the discussions of class and race than this film could ever accomplish, in a more paint-by-numbers comedy that is just boring. The Goldfinch. I get it. The book was much more intricate with what its philosophy was going for, but that doesn't mean the movie adaptation will do the same. While it looks gorgeous in the cinematography done by Roger Deakins, who has now won 2 Oscars thanks to 1917, the story is so barren in emotion that it was like watching paint dry. And while there are some decent performances from certain actors in the film, Ansel Elgort was just not good enough in the film. Maybe next time, Ansel. Wait, what the hell? Steven Spielberg is remaking West Side Story? Oh, you are so on the shit list, buddy. Glass. While at first I was a defender of this film, over time I watched it more and more, I couldn't help but slowly agree with a lot of the criticisms. While I did enjoy the opening of the film, the cinematography, the return of Samuel L. Jackson to one of his more sinister roles as Mr. Glass, and of course an awesome performance from James McAvoy, the story almost completely wastes what could have been an interesting final installment, but instead we get a nonsensical story with blatant plot holes and a twist ending that is an apparent plea to garner a sequel. Glass just ended up being a bit of a disappointment for most fans of Split and Unbreakable. But hey, at least Shyamalan put out Split a couple years ago. Men in Black International says it all for itself. Not only was this entry just a waste of time, but the leads were just not charismatic enough to escape from the MCU. I appreciate the change in direction from being a typical Monster of the Week type movie like the previous films, it instead goes for a more globe-trotting adventure mystery type film like an Indiana Jones trek. But the mystery was not much of a mystery. Everything you could think of for twists is done in this film, and with no variation or substitution. Aside from that, the villain isn't at all interesting. Where in previous films they had charm or hell even a personality, this film instead goes for a Skrulls treatment. I was actually surprised in 2019 how many times the quote-unquote shapeshifter element was used in movies. This isn't even the only one on this list, and we'll get to that one later. Child's Play was just so dumb. What is incredibly odd about this reboot is that currently there are plans for a Child's Play series with Don Mancini, the original creator of the franchise, returning, and it's also based in his timeline. Say what you will about the original series, but they were constantly self-aware, and that was part of the charm of those films. While I do appreciate the score by Bear McCreary and the vocal performance by Mark Hamill was all his own, it just isn't up to par with the original. The original made sense and played to its own silliness, but here nothing makes sense. Like, why can't Andy just dropkick the little shit? He is in his teens and not a little kid like in the original. Surely he could break that doll easily. And speaking of terrible reboots / remakes, Pet Sematary 2019 was one of the worst Stephen King films this year. The original adaptation by Mary Lambert was more atmospheric and thought out than this undead nightmare of a film. I understand for many they wanted a brand new take on the book that was faithful, but I'd argue that this film in particular does the original a disservice. Aside from the obvious changes, it constantly hops back and forth between doing its own thing and just copying from the Lambert adaptation. Not only that, but the acting isn't much better than the original, which even then had some not so good performances either. And let's also not forget that the ending of this movie is just ridiculous. It's a ridiculous ending. As a comic book fan, my heart fluttered when I heard that we'd be getting a horror superhero film done by one of James Gunn's brothers, and the premise was quite solid. A horror slasher take on the Superman myth, where instead of being good, he was somehow an evil monster. The Superman myth has been twisted around before in comics. An example of this would be Red Sun Superman, where instead of him being an all-American hero, he is a struggling leader of Russia during the Cold War. But Brightburn was nothing more than a decent concept. As in execution, it didn't come together in full like it should. The gore is good, but the jump scares are a bit much, and it just leaves everything to be desired. Speaking of bad horror films, the Conjuring universe seems to be heading downhill really fast. What could have become an awesome series of distinct horror films with new ideas and concepts quickly devolved into formulaic haunted house attractions with nothing to show for it. But the worst one came this year in a secret project known as The Curse of La Llorona. Not only does this have a lot of the same issues as previous installments in the Conjuring series, but it also does a disservice to the original legend in Spanish folklore. The original tale of La Llorona is chilling, and I'd recommend you check it out if you're into that sort of thing, but this film rarely focuses on what makes the legend unique, and instead goes for the generic. You know what's worse than bad horror films? Bad comedies. The Hustle is such a forced piece of cinema that it becomes so exhausted from its laughter at itself. While I am not opposed to a buddy comedy, the way The Hustle goes about doing quote-unquote comedy is very unfunny, with a lot of run-on jokes that become stale even before it is used. I just really couldn't get into it. Halloween 2018 was a film that had a lot of divided fans, but most overall seemed to enjoy it. And since then, there has been a worrying trend of making cash grab sequels that retcon certain parts of the franchise history. Terminator Dark Fate was everything wrong with the trend. Not only does the film automatically contradict Terminator Judgment Day by killing John Connor in the first minutes of the film, but there is never any justification for having done so in the first place later on in the film. Sure, it gives Sarah Connor some depth, but you could have done the same if he was alive. Maybe both of them work together to help the new target since John and Sarah successfully defeated Skynet. You could get some real emotions from fans and the characters if John Connor went out in a blaze of glory from going from being the one that was the leader of the Resistance to being the protector of the new Resistance leader. It could have been an interesting story. By far one of the most disgusting looking animated films of 2019, The Addams Family. While the main family looks like their comic counterparts and the voice cast is on point, it's what is outside of the family that is truly horrendous. Bad character models of every other character mixed with a very substandard plot that Hotel Transylvania has done before time and time again, and you get an uninspiring, tired film with nowhere to go. The first of the bad comic book films this year, Dark Phoenix is a truly baffling experience all around. The storyline makes almost no sense and is absolutely unwarranted. Apocalypse, for all its faults, ended on a note that felt like it was coming full circle to the Bryan Singer films that we were promised that these films would lead up to. But here comes Dark Phoenix, where somehow there are shape-shifting aliens that pose as the Hellfire Club because they want Jean's powers. Mystique dies way ahead of when she is supposed to be cured in X-Men The Last Stand, and of course we need to tear down Charles Xavier because that is the trend to deconstruct heroes, even though in this film it makes no sense to. This isn't like Logan. This was just bad from every perspective. Who would have thought that a film that was delayed for 2 whole years would be a bad film? Here's to hoping the New Mutants isn't the final death nail for the Fox X-Men films. But then again, who's to say that it isn't dead already, and the New Mutants isn't just beating a dead horse? I love Keanu Reeves. John Wick was where he got his comeback stride, and from there, he has been in some really great projects, including the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077 and the Bill and Ted third movie that's coming out, Bill and Ted Face the Music. I hope it is breathtaking. But much like all actors, eventually they find another dud in their career, and his was Replicas. What started as an interesting premise about moving a person's consciousness into a new body quickly turns into a run-down sci-fi schlock action film that the producers are known for, with their previous stuff like Transformers. And let's not forget that the cinematography also clashes heavily with the drama that should have been there, and an ending that just doesn't work. Out of all the comic book films this year, none could have been worse than Hellboy 2019. Everything from the behind-the-scenes struggle between the director and David Harbour, to the misshapen narrative and the terrible edit for the film, it seems like everything went wrong with the production. Say what you will about the Del Toro films from the early to mid-2000s, at least his style complemented the story being told and the atmosphere of what he was adapting. But the new Hellboy tries to ape on the Deadpool craze, which unsurprisingly took away from the identity of Hellboy as a character. Not to mention the VFX half the time looked unfinished, and the narrative starts and starts again like it had a secret love affair with Suicide Squad. It is truly something when an actor can go from a laughingstock to someone to take more seriously. Adam Sandler and Robert Pattinson both got the treatment when the Safdie brothers made Uncut Gems and Good Time respectively. But what happens when ego goes to a person's brain? You get the Fanatic. 2019's new take on The Room is unexpected, to be sure. Travolta's performance is truly something to laugh over as you get drunk with friends. The story takes itself so seriously that everything comes off as hilarious as a result. The thriller aspect isn't at all thrilling, as it thinks it wants to be, and the cardinal sin is calling back to your own musical discography. Do you have any shame, lead singer from Limp Bizkit? Empty Metal is the worst film I have ever seen at a film festival to date. Everything from the cinematography to the editing, the story especially, all did not work. The acting in this film is like something out of the prequels, of how just monotone most of the characters are. What could have been easily told in a short film about how people are radicalized in cults is painfully stretched into a feature film. A film that is so boring and pretentious that it wallows in its own self-importance. This film was so bad, in fact, that during its first showing at the Eastern Oregon Film Festival last year, half of the audience for that film left. You know it's bad when people start walking out halfway through. Dumbo, Aladdin, The Lion King, and Lady and the Tramp 2019 all have the same problems, regardless of which one is worse than the others. All of them suffer from the same money-hungry nature from Disney to exploit nostalgia by repackaging the same story but done worse each and every time. The music, one of the most recognizable aspects of each of the films, are all done worse than their counterparts. If you want more clarification on that point, here is a video link to see a video done by a friend of mine. Dumbo took the heart of what made that film, being the conflict between Dumbo and the others making fun of him, and made it into a pointless film with a lot of bad storytelling. Oh, the daughter is good in science? Does that come back in any way? Nope, not until the end when she gives her dad a new hand. The film tries so hard to be different from its problematic predecessor that in the end the circus becomes animal-free. I admit that the original Dumbo had its bad parts with the crows, but everything else worked just fine in that one. Just how simple the storytelling was. And I guess that is the overall problem with many of these remakes. taking what is a simple moral tale and expanding them to become bloated messes of films. But the worst out of all of these is The Lion King. A film that was nearly perfect is worsened by the film's existence. The CG will be dated eventually. The animation for the musical sequences take all the pep out of the step of the once classic music from the film, with one of the songs, Be Prepared, seeming like they didn't intend on putting it in the film in the first place, so it just feels like it has a bunch of low energy. Truly one of the worst aspects of this year in film was this from Disney. These remakes will never stop. But if the CG in The Lion King wasn't bad enough, Cats has you covered. Cats, the film that forced me to use text-to-speech for my review of the movie. Cats, the film that somehow made the Oscars shortlist before being taken off. Cats, the film that had to be given a patch to fix some errors in the CG that could have been helped if Cats was pushed from its original release date to another more extensive release date to make the whole thing refined. Cats, a film that no one wanted, yet everyone wanted to see because of how bad it was going to be. Cats could have been the worst film of this year if it wasn't for one last entry on the list. And that final film is The Haunting of Sharon Tate. Say what you will about Tarantino's foot fetish film. I mean, my god, how many shots of feet are there in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? At least with Tarantino, he didn't say that his film was straight up a biopic and then lie to make a horror movie by exploiting the tragedy. At least Tarantino didn't use real footage from the crime scene back in '69 in an effort to bring authenticity to a film that eventually goes back on its biopic genre in favor of a bad horror film. Hell, at least Tarantino's production design all around was authentic to the 60s. The Haunting of Sharon Tate looks like it took place in the goddamn 90s. What this film ultimately did was take a tragic moment in American history and exploit it for cheap scares and easy money, but luckily that backfired, making only $20,000 in the box office and another $10,000 off of home sales. Who knows how much this movie was really made for, but somehow this asshat of a director is still making films, with a brand new film that came out earlier this year exploiting the death of Nicole Brown Simpson. Have you no shame? This director of this movie should never be allowed to work on any film ever again. And that was the worst of 2019. Truly some of the worst films to come out of the last decade, but there is always a bright side to everything. So tune in next time when we will be taking an extensive look at the best films of 2019. See you in the next video.